Welcome to the Australia-India Institute's panel discussion on literature, political writings, and their influence on the Indian freedom struggle. This discussion is a part of our annual week celebration, which is the India Week. Today with us, we have a stellar panel, which will be moderated by Ms. Devanshi Jain. Devanshi is the founder of Edit Ops and the former founding managing editor of The Curious Reader, an online literary magazine. She is also an on-deck writing fellow, a non-practicing lawyer, and a lifelong learner. She never goes anywhere without a book. I will now hand over to Ms. Jain to introduce the panel and take forward the discussion.
Thank you, Parul. Good morning and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have some wonderful speakers with us. To begin with, we have Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar, a noted Indian poet, critic, and academician of many years of standing. She has been the recipient of many prestigious grants, as well as national and international fellowships and residencies. Her major research project with the UGC led to the publication of her book, Narrating Partition, Text, Interpretations, Ideas. She is the chief editor of the book entitled Cultural Diversity, Linguistic Plurality, and Literary Traditions of India, a textbook prescribed by the University of Delhi for course use in its honors BA program. Dr. Kumar has over 4 decades of teaching experience as an associate professor of graduate and postgraduate courses in English and American literature, as well as Indian literature and translation. Today, she will talk about literature as a source of inspiration for people to participate in the freedom struggle. Dr. Debjani Sengupta is the author of The Partition of Bengal, Fragile Borders and New Identities, 2016. She has edited Map-Making Partition Stories from Two Bengals, 2011. Sengupta's translations from Bangla include authors like Tagore that have been published in Harvard University Press's Essential Tagore. She also teaches at the Department of English, IP College, University of Delhi. Today, she will talk about Rabindranath Tagore's political essays, which were written in the context of the Swadeshi Andolan in Bengal. Then we have Dr. Rachna Mehra, an assistant professor in urban studies program, Ambedkar University, Delhi. She graduated from St. Stephen's College and completed her PhD in history from JNU. Her research interests include partition studies, gender and refugee rehabilitation policies in India, urban history of small towns and cities. She will talk about political writings, press, and their influence with a focus on Gandhi and Tilak. So today we're going to be talking about the influence of literature and other forms of writing on the freedom struggle. Historically, literature has been used and is still being used as propaganda. We only have to look at North Korea for that. But literature has also been responsible for ushering in revolution throughout history. Even in India, if you look at it, we had political writings, pamphlets, newspapers, fiction, poetry. All of these came together to reach out to the common people and convince them that we need to all rise up as one nation against the British. If you look at literature in particular, there were the main reason literature worked as a source of inspiration was that it reached out to the common people. Most of it written at the time featured common people who were rising up against the British. They were leaving homes and families to go out, and that is what made the literature relatable. Now, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyayas Anandmat is a classic example of that. And in that, ordinary men and women left homes and fought against the British Army and won, despite being untrained soldiers. The book was banned, of course, by the British and only was available freely after independence. And the main reason for that was that it featured what we now know as our national song, Bande Mataram, which was then taken up as a rallying cry by the people of the time. So there were a whole bunch of people who would be singing, who would be screaming Bande Mataram out there. They would be carted off to jails, and they would continue to sing Bande Mataram. Another really important role that literature played at this time was in bringing women into the fold. A lot of literature also had women as protagonists or women as part of the freedom movement, which inspired women as well to take up arms. A classic example of this is another book by Mr. Chattopadhyay called Devi Chaudhrani, where a woman was the main protagonist as well as the leader of the struggle and a major inspiration to women. Now I'll hand it over to Dr. Kumar to speak further about literature as a source of inspiration for people to participate in the freedom struggle. Dr. Kumar, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. And I believe now I'm audible. Well, I think this is what literature does. It can create a certain kind of dumbness and at the same time make one very articulate. It's just a question of muting and unmuting oneself. And the unmuting, and thank you so much for a generous introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. And I think to start with, I do want to make a general point about literature. And I want to say that literature, in any case, the Hindi word for literature is sahitya, which actually means to identify with the other, to be with the other. So I think this is something to be, thought of, because in literature, the word etymology of literature is very different. The word literature is very different. However, I'm referring to the Hindi version only because I feel that literature definitely does not exist in a vacuum. It is addressing other people, and it is also projecting in itself the times in which it is produced. So even if there is a spirit of defiance against the times, even that is kind of encapsulated in a form of literature. And that defines, as you very rightly pointed out in your introductory remarks, Devanshi, this was about Bankim Chandra, how, Anandmat was banned. It was banned. It was a defiant kind of a tone that one read out there. But in this defiance, there was the pulse of the people that was captured. And I think that is the beauty of literary output, literary articulation, because there is a kind of a hankering and a search for freedom, essentially. And here we are talking about political freedom, which obviously also ties up with essentially freedoms of all kinds that an individual cherishes, and particularly in literary expression. So there was this combative kind of a situation as to, on the one hand, literature is telling the truth, but to what extent is this truth acceptable? Particularly if you have that kind of British atrocities, the way they were going on, and if you have a government against which you want to you have an outrage, and you need that space. We always use the term space. That space is needed to create, to articulate, whether it's defiance or telling the truth. And literature is all about telling the truth. That is why it is said that fiction can tell you more about reality than what reality is to the eye. It depends on how a sensitive person is perceiving that reality and how there is a search for truth. So literature's role has been tremendous, particularly in the times when there was this freedom struggle and there was a surplus, in fact, huge amount of, number of ideas that were floating around, particularly with somebody like the stalwart Gandhi being around. And there were so many Gandhian ideas that were floating around. And the first example I want to give, and I'm very, very passionate about that particular novel, and I want to refer to Raja Rao here. And Raja Rao's Kanthapura, that novel, it was kind of, on the one hand, very rooted into, the Indian ethos, but there was also a synthesis with Western kind of ideas of freedom, democracy, etc., etc. So Raja Rao's sensibility and the thrust that he had, the aggressive thrust of being very innovative in the form that he created in Kanthapura. And Kanthapura, what is Kanthapura? The name of a village which had only about 24 families, that's all. Small village, a sleepy town, kind of, not even a town, a village, a very sleepy kind of a village. He chooses to take on a sleepy town only because there is a kind of a, what is the objective? The objective, I believe, in that novel is that the writer shows as to how one major Gandhi managed to create so many Gandhis, miniature Gandhis, in different villages and different parts of the country. And so there is this protagonist called Murthy, who is considered to be a kind of a Gandhi, who is in a way defiant, but defiant against what? Against the caste system, against the oppressive British government, and is trying to mobilize people into coming together. So one Gandhi, the shadow of whom you see in Murthy, in Kantapura, and in this novel you see how there is an awakening. So this awakening that happens is for the pursuit of liberation from various constrictions from within the society and from outside of the society. In the sense that from within the society, there is this oppressive caste system operating. And so the novel also talks about how, you know, different caste, people belonging to different castes live in different geographical areas, because they don't intermix, you know, and there is a hierarchy of sorts out there. So this defiance that is shown, and Murthy is articulating this defiance. He wants to break all the notions of, you know, oppressive, hierarchical caste system. Not this happening from the ground, from the roots, you know, in a village. So I think the triumph of this novel lies in the fact that there is this, I would call it mobilization that you see, a certain kind of subtle mobilization. It is not direct sloganal, you know, well, that can also happen when people walk in the street to, you know, with the banners and so on, searching for freedom. But in this case, it is the awakening of the mind first and foremost. Literature is able to do that, because it is working not through the discipline of only political science or sociology or a politician's mind or anything, but it is working at evolving a sensibility of a certain kind, subtly at various levels, psychologically, sociologically, and of course with the political fervor that was instigated in a way, or inspired is a better word, inspired by Gandhi himself. So similarly, you have another, please tell me when to stop. There is another novel called Untouchability, which is, not Untouchability, about untouchability, but it's called The Untouchable. And this is by Mulk Raj Anand. So these were contemporaries, and these are the stalwarts, Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand. These are the people who at R.K. Narayan, these are the people who started with English writing in English rather, in India with very down-to-earth themes, and the themes which really led to a certain kind of awakening, as I'm saying. So I think we need to pause and think about these novels of this kind on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was this fantastic poetry happening by people like, you know, in Hindi, Balkrishna Sharma, for instance, Balkrishna Sharma Naveen. He wrote, and I noted these two lines, Kavi kuch aisi taan sunao jisse uthal puthal mat jaye. So give us some lyrics which are going to really create chaos in the society, because it is out of this chaos, out of this society going topsy-turvy, and everything should be destabilized so that we can ask for freedom in a very sane fashion. So first, the status quo has to be changed. And so this kind of inspirational writing that was happening, and these lines, and also Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, who is actually invoking Jhansi Ki Rani, the Queen of Jhansi, who was a protagonist of one of the protagonists of 1857 War of Independence. And that is where the struggle for freedom started in a way. So this lady, Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, in Hindi, wrote lines which are now in the textbook and were being taken to the, on the roads, and people were singing this. So there was this inspirational kind of writing. Dinkar was writing, for instance, So such like literature, which actually was very motivational, was mobilizing, was churning emotions on the one hand, and on the other hand, also portraying what existed in society, the kind of oppressions. So if you are face to face with the oppressive state kind of patterns of thought and administration, etc., etc. If you are face to face with that, only then you will fight it. You have to confront the oppression to be able to realize how to fight it. So I think this fighting also, and in that case, in that sense, I think I would be failing if I do not mention even Premchand. Premchand, who was writing, works like Rangabhumi, Karma Bhumi, such like, works in which he was, even Godan, for instance, there was always, if not in the forefront, but in the backdrop, the whole idea of having to fight for freedom and how things needed to change. And it is this kind of a change, this kind of a literature in a way becomes almost like a catalyst then, It is getting into the psyche of human beings. So they were, you also had a lot of pamphlets, etc., on the one hand, where there was direct political, messages being transmitted, etc. But on the other hand, to me, literary output becomes more important because there is a certain kind of sensitivity with which these, forms of art function and the way they get communicated to everybody. And that is why we come out with statements like, oh my God, this is so moving, this is so touching, because it touches you to go into the field, into the battleground, which is that of life itself, to fight certain battles, sometimes overtly and sometimes subtly.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. That was enlightening. And I love what you said about an awakening of the mind. And I think that's something we always need and probably will always need. And whenever I think of awakening of the mind, it always reminds me of Rabindranath Tagore's Where the Mind is Without Fear. And on that note, I'll pass on the discussion to Dr. Devjani Sengupta, who will speak about Rabindranath Tagore's political essays.
Thank you, Devanshi. Thank you, Australia India Institute, for bringing us all together on this platform to celebrate India and India Week and India's freedom struggle. And as we are looking at the nationalist movement, and as we are looking at literature, I want to really focus a little bit on Tagore's writings, because Tagore's political essays on titled Nationalism, which he wrote in 1916 to 17 on his tour to Japan and the US, are very well known amongst the English-speaking world. But there are a number of other essays which he actually wrote much earlier, which are not so very well known, and which, although written in the context of the Swadeshi Andolan, I'll just explain in a minute what that was. But those essays are, I think, extremely perspicuous about their political philosophy and about giving us a template, I would say a political and moral template for the country. And I think much of that template has gone indirectly into our great constitution. Ambedkar, of course, is celebrated as the father of the Indian Constitution, and rightly so. His was a brilliant mind who conceived of this gigantic tome, which sets out, so to say, the moral and political philosophy of a nation. But to a very, very large extent, if you really dig into the Constitution, you will see some ideas that are very directly traceable to Tagore himself. And now this is, of course, quite well known that Tagore and Gandhi had a very long conversation about aspects of nationalism and aspects of how to go about it and the way in which we can fight. And there were very interesting philosophical differences between the two. But I don't want to focus on that because that is an area which is very well known. But I want to actually talk a little bit about something which happened a little earlier. In 1905, Lord Curzon decided to partition Bengal, and this was the first partition that Bengal was to face with. And this was done ostensibly for administrative purposes, but actually it was to strike a blow into the unity of Hindu and Muslim nationalists who were becoming a very strong force in undivided Bengal. And in 1905, when I'm talking of undivided Bengal, it is not just West Bengal and Bangladesh. It had parts of Assam, Bihar, and Orissa as well. So it was a very gigantic place, geographical area. Now, with the declaration on 19th of July 1905 that Bengal would be partitioned, absolute public outrage erupted on the streets of Calcutta and Dhaka and all the small towns and villages across Bengal, because people just rose up in a body to resist this horrendous idea to divide them. And one of the people whose writings were absolutely on the forefront of this Andolan was Tagore himself. His many songs which have been composed during the Swadeshi Andolan, one of them is, of course, Bangladesh's national anthem today, Amar Shonar Bangla, Ami Tomaye Bhalobashi, my beautiful golden Bengal, I do love thee. And these songs were something which sort of absolutely charged people's imaginations and charged them to sort of take ownership of the idea that Bengal did not belong to the colonizers. It belonged to the people. And the people who lived in that land and people who died in that land and who labored in that land. So this Andolan began with a call to boycott foreign goods, and mainly British manufactured clothes, cotton clothes. This is quite well known that the whole idea of imperial economy was to take the raw material from India and take it to the manufacturing units in England and bring back the goods and sell it to Indians back again. Now, the Swadeshi nationalists thought that they should break this chain by giving this idea of boycott of foreign salt and foreign cloth and matchsticks and all other European goods which had penetrated the Indian market. Now, what Tagore realized, and it's very interesting that he, who is a literary figure, actually realizes where the problem lies in this boycott, in this call to boycott. And it's very interesting that none of the nationalists actually realize this. And he puts this problem bang in the middle of a novel called The Home and the World, Ghare Baire, which actually depicts the impossibility of the call of boycott to succeed in Bengal, particularly where there is a very large amount of Muslim and lower caste peasants who could not afford the expensive Indian cloth whereas the European manufactured cloth was very, very cheap. That is the whole point of capitalism, that cheap goods are to be brought to the market. So the whole idea of boycott became an extremely elitist idea. Only people who could afford those to wear expensive Indian handlooms could actually afford to also burn European clothes. And in the context of this, and I'm just going to finish in another minute, in the context of this, Tagore saw a kind of extreme oppression, an extreme economic oppression that the nationalists did on their own people. People who could not afford to buy Indian clothes were forced to burn European clothes, which they actually could afford. And they were actually physically, in many cases, in Ghare Baire, you will actually see that there are physical scenes where a mob shouting Bande Mataram. I want to actually bring in the complexity of that term Bande Mataram here. The mob shouting Bande Mataram and going and forcibly shutting a market where Muslim and lower caste peasants are shopping. They burn their boats, which brings the goods to the village market. They burn their houses, and all in the name of Bande Mataram. So Tagore is very interested in the fact that, you know, these slogans, which have come as a kind of rallying cry to the people, can also become instruments of oppression. And I'm very interested in this very ambiguous way in which he depicts this complexity. You know, it's not just gray, black and white. On the ground, there are other shades of gray. So when we talk of nationalism, you know, we sometimes forget that there are within Indian nationalism certain strands of oppressive practices which have somehow emerged again after many years. And here I want to just stop. I hope, you know, I have sort of brought out some questions, but I just want to stop with some reading some lines from this wonderful essay that Tagore wrote 3 years after the boycott calls were given. In 1908, he writes this brilliant essay called Badhi o Pratikar, The Disease and the Cure. It's very interesting. Look at the title, The Disease and the Cure. Here is a man of letters talking like a doctor. And he is a moral compass. He is a moral compass to the nation. He wants to hold up a mirror to ourselves and say that, look, there are things which you are doing, which in the name of humanity are completely wrong. And I'm reading from Badhi o Pratikar, quote, "We must realize that when the foreign king departs from this land, it will not become our motherland. We must earn our country through our own efforts. We must be the mainstay to our countrymen by giving them food and shelter, health, happiness, and education. We must learn to do the best for the country in times of sorrow and hardship. When we understand this truth in the innermost core of our hearts, then we will also realize our country. There will not be any need to give speeches to make people understand the meaning of the word Desh." You know, when I read these lines, tears come to my eyes. He is so much a man with a foresight. These were written in 1908 and 2021. I think they still ring true. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Sengupta. That was certainly enlightening. And I think Rabindranath Tagore is one of the biggest literary stalwarts, and I think a major figure of nationalism. And pretty much everything you told us only seems to highlight that. And thank you for all that knowledge. And the last few lines in particular were fabulous. I'd never read them before, but I couldn't help but smile when I read them, when I heard them. Just a reminder. Just a reminder to the attendees, please send your questions. I know some of you have already done that. We'll be doing a Q&A with the panelists after everybody's spoken. I now request Dr. Mehra to talk about political writings, press, and their influence with the focus on Gandhi and Tilak.
Thank you, Devanshi. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. And so it's very interesting how Professor Sukrita and Professor Debjani has already laid out the way in which literature spoke about the national movement, or it inspired the national movement in many ways. And before I come to the political writings, which we all are sort of familiar with because of the leaders who have taken in the forefront the call for the struggle movement, I want to talk about the precursors to these political leaders specifically, and bring in the element of the idea of what was the representation of women in these political struggle movements. And I think it's important to know that women were usually seen as those more related to or contributing towards social reform, or as participants in the political movement, or as contributors who were supplementing and supporting the movement. But women as political spokesperson or visionaries or administrators, their role has been shadowed in the writings of freedom struggle movement. And just to say that this might not be true, in fact, because there is enough work. Radha Kumar has come up with this very good edited work on the idea of the women, the history of doing itself, through which you get to know their participation, which is much more than just a supportive role. And as we go back today, Professor Debjani talked about the 1905 Bengal partition, but before that, in 1857, when we see the freedom struggle movement also draws a lot from the Indian uprising of 1857, where Begum Hazrat Mahal and Rani Lakshmi Bai, they actually led the troops in the battlefield. And it's important to remember the Begums of Aoud, who also contributed and made a very influential role in the politics of the state, in how it was being delineated at that point in time. Because one would think that it's not just in the battlefield that they were present, but also they were communicating, handling letters, treaties, and issuing instructions, through which their political discourse becomes available to everyone to read. And also, as I would look at the role and contribution of Madam Kama, Bikaji Kama, Pandita Ramabai, and Annie Besant, who played a very stellar role in contributing to the idea, or the emergence of the idea of self-rule, which comes about later in the writings of Tilak and Gandhi. So just to give you a brief idea about how Madam Bikaji Kama, she kind of spread the awareness of political consciousness, not just in India, but much before that, in 1906 itself, where she settled in London. And she kind of, her political career began when she came under the contact of Shyamji Krishna Verma. And she took immediate steps to contact all the nationalists over Ireland, Russia, Egypt, and Germany, and created opportunities abroad so that she could talk about the British government and their policies. So it's interesting to talk about and connect it from Professor Debjani's idea of Bande Mataram, or others who have spoken, or the idea of what was happening in Bengal through the writings of Tagore and other writers, that we come that whole, it was in as early as in 1907 itself, when she gave her speech in the International Socialist Congress in Germany in fact in 1907. She spoke about how millions pounds were being taken from India, the whole idea of poverty in India. And then she ended with unfolding the Indian national flag, the tricolor in yellow, red, and green, and with the words of Bande Mataram written in the middle band. So she's the first Indian woman who unfolded the Indian national flag in a foreign country before an international gathering. That kind of gave a status of the Indian, it created a field for the Indian movement at in an international context before those writings and those ideas came in or were produced in India itself. So, despite the famous Press Act, which we hear of so many press acts which were imposed here, in fact, in 1910, there was an act which was imposed by the bureaucratic government, and many were actually thrown into jail for creating seditious kind of writings or sharing pamphlets. But Bikaji Kama was not defeated with these kinds of measures. She actually had her own press. She started her own press after some time and started writing prolifically on the ideas and issues and spreading those work from different parts of the world, and also looking at that work in Calcutta, Pune, Lahore, to Paris, Geneva, Berlin. And another person, Annie Besant, comes to my mind, who, though born in London in the latter part of the 19th century, was the one who was using and associated with the national movement in India, because she had this whole idea of coming to India and talking about the self-rule here. So she began with a monthly journal in English and associated herself, in fact, with that monthly journal, which was Arya Balabodhini, and it was issued at a nominal rate of 1 rupee per annum. And here she talks about how to restore India and her past greatness in the religion, and recovering all the vitality and strength to her through the religious diversity which India has. So there were not just the press, but also pamphlets which were published, in which there was a proper critical outlook towards the government and its policies. So in fact, Annie Besant said that she started working at the village councils level to talk about local self-government. And by 1914, she even joined Indian National Congress and brought new ideas, talents, and resources to look at what would self-rule mean at this point in time. So her writings and speeches during this period mainly dealt with poverty of India, the drain, the home charges, which Dadabhai Naoroji was also talking of, employment of Indians in the public services, executing the kind of biases which they have in administration and justice commissions. So thinking of women not just as social reformers, but also as political spokesperson becomes important when we look at both Besant's work and Bikaji Kama's work. So home rule, according to what Besant said, was not a form of government that makes home rule, but it is a nation which is governing in itself. And it's a nation which is free to vote and also be able to stand autocratically. So these ideas are something which I say were promulgated much before when Gandhi and Lokmanya Tilak, or at least were contemporary to them, rather than which are completely attributed to these great leaders. Another important person, Pandita Ramabai, I want to talk about, is who moved from Bengal to Pune and started the Arya Mahila Samaj. So it was a social reform movement to produce education for women in India, but more importantly, they also supported the idea when in 1882 a commission was set up by the government that there should be education in India and women's education should be given priority. So these women they received it very positively, this government proposition that women should be educated. And then Pandita Ramabai also actually worked, though, for the high caste widows in India and to set up a home for them. Sharda Sadan was set up in Bombay in 1889. So apart from social reform, just to bring the idea of education, not just as a social reform, but as a political intervention is important, because there were not many women who were educated enough, or there were some social roles in which they were bracketed, because of which they could participate in the political movement, but not write as political visionaries. So these three women were important in setting up the stage for women and for men also to understand what the idea of nation will emerge. Quickly, I'll go to Lokmanya Tilak, who also used the idea of religious revivalism of Hinduism and based himself on the strong cultural traditions of Hinduism. And he wrote through Kesari and Maharatha, one being in English and Kesari being in Marathi. And these two newspapers became very important in terms of bringing out, again, a strong critique of the policies of the government. At that point also, Tilak in fact gave the idea of notion of Swaraj and said that Swaraj is the birthright of India's and we should have it. So that kind of slogan becomes a clarion call for different kinds of movement to begin within India. So Tilak was very clear that educating young children was not enough. Elderly people also needs to be brought into that fold. And when he started up, in 1885, he set up the Deccan Education Society, which was also later named as the Ferguson College. So these kind of movements in terms of bringing in education and also consolidated writings through the press, though were looked down by the government, they continuously produce different kinds of protest movements within India. Now, Tilak was also involved in famous 4-point action program, through which he finally able to, Congress also adopted that, and because of which there were charges against what was written in his newspaper Kesari. He was in fact sentenced to 6 years rigorous imprisonment and deported to Mandalay. But interestingly, the kind of writings he produced was something which inspired people to take on the revolutionary aspect of the national movement, which was becoming very popular at that time. In fact, in 1897, when there was a plague and Chaplekar brothers were convicted of killing the plague commissioner, Mr. Rand, because they said that they were inspired by the writings given in Kesari and Maharatha at that point in time. So that revolutionary strand is what something which goes before Gandhi comes on the scene and who talks about non-violence and tries to exhibit it through his writings. So Gandhi's journalism was again a very crucial transformatory element, which because Gandhi was extremely prolific writer and he had this ability to connect people from the rural to the urban, from different castes, from different regions, because he was very clear through his publications of the vernacular press specifically that you need to get back to what Professor Sukrita was saying, that we need to get back to the grassroots level to be able to connect to people. So language, vernacular language became an important way in which ideas were being disseminated. So Gandhi wrote on Hind Swaraj, published in Gujarati in 1909, and that became the intellectual blueprint for the India's independence movement. Then he also wrote in Harijan, in Gujarati, in Hindi, and in English language. But most importantly, his ideas were framed through the Indian opinion when he was in South Africa, because he was a lawyer and he had got the platform to evolve as a person, to organize, mobilize, and also so various modes of struggles which he did practiced in India were actually first formulated through his representations, petitions, and memorandums when he wrote against racism in South Africa itself. So it's interesting to see that what Jigyasa Meena has also written about in her work on Gandhi and his presence in South Africa, that the press essentially performed the fundamental task of collecting that, constructing a collective Indian identity in South Africa from a socio-cultural and political perspective. And it connected broader sense those people who had never physically met, the imagined community of Benedict Anderson. So that kind of fueled the imagination of how you can bring people with linguistic and different kinds of diversities together. And this was foregrounded that through the fact that these heterogeneous sections then became rooted in a homogeneous identity of the Indian nation, which was still informing. It had not become, it was still in becoming. So those kind of things through different articles and later on the journals like the Young India in English, Navjeevan, a Gujarati monthly journal, all were written through the works of Gandhi, and also his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, all this kind of ways in which Gandhi used to infuse the idea of nationalism. Now, most importantly, he persuaded people to move beyond their sectional barriers and introducing the different linguistic mediums through his newspaper. So for him, it was important that if the community has to come together, you have to pick up myriad issues. And those issues could be of race, politics, religion, caste, health, community, even the fact he would talk about indentured labor, peasants. So the whole idea of weaving together these different issues or the problems which people were facing and then putting them through his writing made Gandhi so popular, because he could talk and use any issue to begin a movement. For example, the use of salt itself in the Dandi March. Now, salt is a commodity which is found in every household, which connects to women as well as to those who everyone consumes salts in a way. So he has this remarkable ability to use any issue, but also be able to present it politically through his writings, which become very important in understanding how he created the Indian national movement. So these are the writers I want to talk about, and I would be happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Mehra. I think what you've spoken about, yes, you did speak about Gandhi and Tilak, but I found the role of women a lot more interesting, especially because we don't often hear about it. And considering we are an all-women panel, I think it's particularly fitting. On the topic of women and representation, I do feel that whether it's in our history books or in literature, it is rare to find women as either leading characters or as significant characters. But I think that's where a lot of the authors of the time excelled, that even if they didn't make them the main protagonists, they did give them important roles. And there's this one line from Anandmat, which one of the characters, Shanti, says when she makes a case to join the cause, which is, which hero ever became a hero without the cooperation of his wife? And I think that is so true, because it is only with the support of women that men have been able to go out and do all the things they did, right? So I thank you for shedding a light on the role which women heroes played in our freedom struggle. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Kumar, Dr. Sen Gupta for teaching us so much today about the books we should be reading to understand what went on at that time. And I think, Dr. Sen Gupta, one of the things which you, the Partition of Bengal, what I have observed is that we talk a lot about the partition of Punjab, but I don't think the Partition of Bengal gets enough attention. And this for me was rectified when one of my co-workers, because she did an MA in English and she worked on the Partition of Bengal, and she told me that, we speak a lot about what happened. Khushwant Singh has written about it. A lot of mainstream writers write about it, but even the Partition of Bengal was equally fraught, equally heartbreaking, but we don't seem to hear too much about it. So I'm really grateful to you for shedding a light on that for all of us, and for inspiring us to read more literature which shows us what we should do in these times. Thank you. And moving on to the questions, please keep sending them as and when. So the first question is for Dr. Kumar. Could you speak a little on the role of Indian poetry?
Poetry, is this Indian poetry in general?
Sorry, my mistake. It's Urdu poetry. Sorry.
Oh yeah. In fact, I love it, because this question I was hoping somebody would ask, because I didn't get the time to really, focus on poetry that was happening or literature that was being created in other languages. And Urdu, by the way, was one of the most important languages at that time. Not just after Persian. Persian was the language of the courts, but Urdu was the language of the streets. And Urdu was a very common language, much more popular than Hindi at that time. But what I want to talk about a little bit about, how, whether it was the very slogan, Inqilab Zindabad, it came out of the Urdu, Hazrat Mohani's, kind of pen. That's what he created. And that, I think, even today we use that, Inqilab Zindabad, all the time. So there was, in terms of poetry, how can we forget, say, Iqbal? Muhammad Iqbal, Sare Jahan se acha Hindustan hamara, I mean, that is at the crux of this entire point about, how to arouse patriotic feelings and that sentiment. And that patriotism came out of, song and poetry and slogans of this kind, which came from Allama Iqbal, Hazrat Mohani, and I can actually, there are many, many people like Majaz, even Kaifi Azmi was writing before, Ali Sardar Jafri, all this group of progressive writers, the poets, who were creating so much of literature at that time and talking about the other side, in the Bengal side, Begum Rukaiya, for instance, she was very actively writing. And there were these, and I think one should not forget that all these writers, and soon after partition happened, for instance, there were a lot of Urdu literature happened on partition then, the whole body of literature that was created in Urdu, more in Urdu than in Hindi and Punjabi. That is because Urdu was a language that was taught. So how can we forget this? So there was a very, very fundamental contribution of Urdu poetry in arousing sentiment of patriotism and of the struggle that we needed to get into in order to get freedom. I cannot go into too many examples now, but the voice of freedom, also Hali. How can I forget Hali? Hali Zahabe Watan, So all these poets, it was not as if they were in a group writing poetry, but separately, all of them, except for the progressive writers, where you can have that group sentiment, kind of togetherness to be thought of, ideological togetherness. But in terms of many others who were not even in any group, but all of them basically, many of them thinking of inspiring people to jump into the fray, to fight for and struggle for freedom of the country. And my homage to them.
Thank you. This question was by Anvi, and we now have a question by Nikita, which is just going out to all the panelists, whoever would like to take it up. Given the role played by literature and writings in freedom struggle, how important do you think it is to uphold freedom of speech in order to produce literature relevant to our times?
Yeah, I think all of us
may I take
one.
it?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
May I take it through very simply, in British India, censorship was practiced. In fact, most of the censorship laws are British laws, and they are still carried forward. So is the sedition law, which is so much talked about. And the fact is that in British India, a series of texts got banned regularly. Bankim Chandra is a much later example. Earlier, we have Dinabandhu Mitro's Nil Darpan, which was a very famous and a popular play on the indigo cultivation in Bengal. In the indigo cultivation, food crops were slowly being replaced by indigo cultivation, which were then sent to the cotton industries in Europe. And that resulted in large-scale pauperization of the Bengal peasantry. And Nil Darpan was a very critical play in the late 19th century. And that became a kind of hallmark to what the British called the Dramatic Performances Act, which actually could shut down theaters which had seditious plays. So, I think it is a very important question that has been asked. The question of freedom is intrinsically connected to the act of being free. And the act of being free means to act, the freedom to speak. And speaking is not to be dissociated with thinking, because you can only speak well when you think well. If you do not have thought, then there is no question of speaking. So the act of freedom then is, in political terms, is, I think, encompasses the freedom to think and to speak, sometimes critically, of authority. And that has always been the case, and particularly during India's nationalist struggle. And I think it is a wonderful way in which India has always grappled with very different ideas. Like Rachna spoke about the various public spheres in which, these ideas were coming in. They were being debated, they were being questioned, they were being laid out. And I think that was a very important way in which nationalism actually began to think of not only of itself, not only of the imagined community, not only the nation that it wanted to produce, but also about certain critical ways in which we can look at these larger questions.
Can I just add something to this, please? Just a little bit. Hello?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I just want to say that in the present day context also, because that's, I think, very pertinent, the question that, what about today? I mean, I don't think it has anything to do with the past or present. This whole idea of getting to have that space to allow your imagination to explore the unsaid, the unexplored, with a sense of curiosity. That's what creativity is. And if there are boundaries drawn there, and usually political boundaries come up, whether they happened at the British times or now or whenever. So I think we have to always struggle for freedom. Even today, we have to struggle for that freedom. If there is caution and fear within us all the time as to now, how do we not transgress the boundary, then I think our creativity is framed and there would be a note of falsity in that writing. So it's as important today as any other time, or whether future or in the past. That freedom, which undoubtedly does also mean carry a sense of responsibility from within to pursue that truth. Many people who are pursuing truth do get massacred or sacrificed on the altar or whatever, but one has to be courageous to some extent. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. Just give me a... So just my two bits on this are that I do think it's important to uphold freedom of speech to produce literature. However, I don't think freedom of speech needs to be looked at purely from a governmental point of view. During the course of my time as the Curious Reader, we actually looked at a lot of research on why a lot of Indian authors are not writing about contemporary topics as much. And we realized that a lot of it is, first of all, we found very little about Indian authors not writing about it. So, but what we also found is that in most cases, it is because publishers are not interested because they're afraid to offend people.
Self-censorship.
Yes, there's a lot of self-censorship also because we are living in cancel culture where everything is about knee-jerk reactions and not so much about conversations. So we cannot all agree on everything. We will disagree, but we have to learn to disagree amicably and to accept the disagreement. So I do think that freedom of speech has to be directed by ourselves. We have to monitor how much we enable it and not just expect the government to do everything for us. And to that, I go back to what Dr. Sen Gupta read out from Rabindranath Tagore. We should keep that in mind in this context. And I think we have time for just one more question quickly, which I thought was particularly interesting, which is the inception of print media in India allowed the privileged to publish their opinions, but not the underprivileged. Do you think this feature accentuated the prevalence of disparity, or it was insignificant as all opinions found expression directly or indirectly?
I'll take a dig at it. So more importantly, we think of in what language it was written. So even if it was written in vernacular, it doesn't make sense if people are illiterate. But those kind of pamphlets would be read out by maybe one person who was literate, or to people who would sit in groups and want to listen what Gandhi is saying. So in that sense, creating that awareness became important, that political consciousness through writing became important, and bringing out the issues of Dalit and caste. Maybe it is by the upper caste leaders, but they are the ones who actually wrote about it. Naming a newspaper Harijan means itself, it's a political statement, at people loved by God, and then to bring out those issues, even though it is fraught with all kinds of debates between Ambedkar and Gandhi, it's important that those issues came to fore through the writings of Gandhi. And so I would still agree that it's not that they created those differences, they actually brought to fore those differences, that they exist and it needs to be addressed. So that's important. And just to end on what excellent way in which Professor Kumar and Professor Shane Gupta said, what Manto says is that bol ki lab azad hai. That self-censorship has to go because of that fear. Because of course, during that time also, when Kesri and other newspapers were being written, they knew the kind of repercussions which would have. They would be thrown in prisons, or there'll be cases and charges against them. But that did not stop them, because they didn't go into a self-censorship mode, despite all censorships being in the place.
Thank you. I also would like to just add that fortunately today, there are a lot of independent publishing presses which have taken up the mantle. So we worked with Adivani, which prints Adivasi literature. We worked with Dalit publishing houses, and it's very heartening. And of course, you have Zuban, which represents a lot of usually underrepresented sections of society. So I do think that there's a lot of awareness now. What is interesting is that a lot of authors still choose to go with mainstream media, mainstream publishing houses, also because they have that level of support. When we worked with Adivani, we know how difficult it was for Ruby to actually afford a lot of things. I mean, she could barely send us books to sell, because we were holding a fair and we told her we'll sell her books, and she could barely send us that. Most of the books were written by her, and she did have a couple of other people who would write in, but on the whole, it's not supported by us. The books are not easily available because they're not written by famous names, and a lot of times they're written by names which don't sound familiar to us. And so, there is fortunately that is changing now in terms of representation, because people are taking up the mantle. But yes, we do have a long way to go. Thank you. And thank you, Anima, for your lovely question. And I'm afraid we're out of time now. So please, thank you so much for attending, everybody. And thank you so much to the panelists. It was an honor to be on this panel with you and to hear your wonderful.
Thank you, Devanshi. That was very nice. I enjoyed myself, at least face-to-face with some people, even on the virtual way,
Yes. And
thank you very much.
And now ask Parul to take over.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Devanshi, for eloquently moderating this excellent discussion. I would like to extend my gratitude to our panelists for joining us today and sharing their knowledge on the topic. I think this added a great amount of ideas and value to the conversation, a lot of things which I would have never thought of could have related. This conversation has made me think and maybe go back and read a little more. I think everyone who's attended this must be feeling the same. I would also like to thank Ms. Lazia Nandimpalli and Belong.net for providing the support for this discussion. And lastly, I would like to thank our team at AII for putting together India Week and this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Parul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parul.
Thank you very
for
much.
bringing us together.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.